All right. Can I take the mask off here? Yeah. All right, great. Okay, bonjour. Ça va bien? What's up? What's good? Assalamu alaikum. Welcome, everyone. Really excited to be here today with an incredible panel of guests introducing the ICA Podcast Network, which is the result of a lot of hard work behind the scenes, and I think really has the potential to be transformative. Without going too techno-utopian, I think there's really some powerful work going on. I just want to start out by saying that, as a scholar in the field of mass communication, I find myself with several responsibilities. I have to stay up to date on the most important trends and research in our field. I want to understand always more about the history of our field and the history of certain people and scholars and formations in our field. In addition, we want to make our field speak to the most important and pressing and timely issues that in the world, which scholarship can sometimes be slow to do in real time through other channels. And finally, junior scholars and graduate students need to understand how to connect, navigate their careers, and continue to do the important work and teaching that they do. So for all these reasons, it's important to explore different mediums to do this. Now, I should say that I was recently able to do all of those things. Let me give you an example. I participated in a series over the past couple of weeks of fascinating conversations. Mohan Dutta, who is here with us, hosted an incredible conversation about interventions from the Global South, right? What is the concept of the Global South and how is it relevant to our field? Then I listened to, I was able to engage in a conversation hosted by Moya Bailey, where she talked about the concept of digital alchemy. And also she was introducing and in conversation with two graduate students, and so we got to hear their voices and hear how they were able to intervene in these ways. Then I listened to a conversation hosted by Sarah Banet-Weiser, where she was making really important feminist intervention into sort of binary concepts about transparency and looking at new kinds of worrisome feminist formations. All of this while on my morning walk through Philadelphia to the park, I was able to do this, right? And I just sort of struggled to think how, again, we all have put in the work of staying up to date in these ways through print and the other mediums, but this is just an example, I think, of how powerful this medium can be and how it can transform the work that we have to do here. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is first introduce our panelists, and maybe what I'll do is combine the introductions. We're going to have kind of a lightning round because the ICA Podcast Network is introducing, I believe, 9 new podcasts that everyone should engage with and listen to. I don't even want you all to wait. I want people, while you're at the conference, you can put on a podcast, maybe not while you're walking to the next session, but you understand what I'm saying. You know what I mean? In your hotel, I want everyone to engage. But let's start out. So first of all, we have, can we bring, is Mohan with us virtually? Can we bring him on screen? Yes. Mohan, can you please introduce the podcast, introduce yourself and the podcast, Interventions from the Global South.
Thank you, Chenj. Kia ora koto katoa from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I want to acknowledge the indigenous ancestors of Rangitane on whose land I stand, and also to recognize that decolonization doesn't end with the text, and has to be an ongoing process of reclaiming indigenous land. So the podcast series, Interventions from the Global South, attends to the question of the hegemonic forms of erasure that constitute the disciplinary textures, asking the ways in which ongoing processes of colonization and capitalism produce sites of dispossession that refer to the Global South and that often correspond with the Southern Hemisphere. Recognizing this cognitive epistemicide, then, it seeks to bring about conversations with intellectuals, community organizers, activists from off the Global South to imagine together what an alternative to this infrastructure of capitalism and colonialism looks like, and therefore really engages with the question, what does it mean fundamentally to generate knowledge from and of the Global South that is transformative and creates an invitational opening to building other possibilities.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mohan. And moving quickly to our next podcast host and scholar, we have Moya Bailey, who will introduce herself and interventions from the Global South.
Hello, everyone. Yes, I am Moya Bailey. I host the podcast Digital Alchemy. And Digital Alchemy is a term that I came up with to describe what I see as largely women of color, Black women in particular, taking the social media that exists and refashioning it into a way that creates a possibility for social justice. Taking these tools that were initially created for these capitalistic ends, but then creating something else entirely. And I've been so moved by the people who are doing this on the ground, not just academics. So you'll find in episodes me talking to people who really straddle that line between academic and activists, and folks who are using their research and their relationship to the digital to imagine something else. And I see that as a very dynamic alchemical process.
Absolutely. And let me just say that Moya is at Northwestern, as well as Mohan is at Massey University in New Zealand. And next up, we'd like to have Sarah Banet-Weiser, who is at USC Annenberg and Penn Annenberg, introduce Feminist Network and the Conjuncture.
Thanks, Chenj. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm a joint professor at the two Annenberg schools, which sounds a lot easier than it is. Unlike Moya and Chenjerai, I don't have any experience at all with podcasting. In fact, I have no idea how Nosh convinced me to do this, but I got off a Zoom call with him one day, and I was all of a sudden a podcast host. So my podcast is called Feminist Networks and the Conjuncture, and it really explores the current conjuncture that we are in, and the ways in which feminist networks are built around this conjuncture, ways in which feminist networks are excluded from the conjuncture, and from different points of entry. So I've had people on the podcast that talked about Me Too in India, Me Too in Nigeria. I was privileged to have Moya come on the podcast to talk about misogynoir. I've had people talk about a feminist ethic of care and how we really need to build that into academia in a much more structured and kind of explicit way. I've also had people, graduate students on the show, because like Chenjerai said, I think it's a really great medium for having graduate students talk about their work and their upcoming work. And so we talked about sexual violence on campus, we've talked about television and reality TV, yeah, check it out. It was an incredible experience, and now I'm a podcast host, or was for 6 episodes anyway.
Yes, and having listened to much of it, I just really can attest to I'm like, wow, this is such a pleasure to have this kind of thing, and it also allays any concern someone have that moving into this medium might degrade the quality of scholarship and critique. Next up, we have our ICA president, Nashir Contractor, was at Northwestern. And let me just pause before Nash goes forward to say, so much of this would not have been possible without his administration and work. Probably a couple of years ago, thanks to Mary Beth Oliver, I was invited into a conversation. A former ICA president, Mary Beth Oliver, I should say. Let me not. Oh, yeah, she's still president. Okay.
I'm
okay.
president-elect. She's president.
All these presidents everywhere.
All the mistakes on me, y'all. Y'all understand. All right, I'm sorry. But Mary Beth invited me and said, I really want to get this conversation going. And, oftentimes we hear that kind of promise being made, and then there's just not any future development. However, since that time, many folks in the ICA community were already putting in that work of podcasting, and Nash was able to really pull that together. And you can talk about this, but I just want to say, because I don't know if Nash is going to try to be humble, but there's a lot of work that went into getting this thing up and running, behind the scenes work that needs to be recognized and honored. And so, can you, maybe talk a little bit about that?
Thank you.
And introduce One World, One Network.
Thank you, Chenjerai. And I think that the real thanks go to all the folks that I requested, suckered, cajoled into being the hosts, and the credit really goes a lot to them. And the credit goes to a separate set of stakeholders, namely students at Northwestern who have done all of the production work that has been involved with this. So that's where the credit really goes. I was very fortunate to be at a point where I thought when I was standing for election that this would be a good idea, only to find out at my first executive committee meeting that Mary Beth had already thought about it and said, in fact, I've already scheduled a call. Why don't you join it? So I was a Johnny-come-lately to this party, but I was happy to be at this. The podcast, that series that I didn't even really host, that you want me to talk about, was the one called One World, One Network with the Interrobang, which is, of course, our conference theme. And so I had 6 conference theme co-chairs. And the first episode, all I did was introduce them for about 15 seconds, and then each of them gave their own point of view of what that conference theme meant to them, and it reflected the diversity that I was hoping to see in that conference theme, both celebrating and problematizing the phrase One World, One Network, and in particular, the oneness in the network. And then for the remaining 6 episodes, each of the conference theme co-chairs brought their own guests on to talk about it. And so that's a mini-series, and that's probably coming to an end, has come to an end with this conference now. And so that's the one series that I was most involved with. But I'm really grateful first of all, for Chenjerai and others to help give us guidance along the way, and to those who are here as hosts, and Mohan and Ellen and others who are not here for all the work they've done, and also thank all the guests that they brought on to this thing. So yes, I'm at Northwestern, like Moya. No favoritism there.
Absolutely, wonderful. And by the way, those who are joining us virtually, we will be welcoming your questions in. I see 1 or 2 questions already here. We're going to have a conversation, so just know that your voices will be heard. Next up, we have Sarah Pila Liederman, also at Northwestern, to introduce Growing Up Comm.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm actually representing the entire Student and Early Career Advisory Committee because we are all co-hosts of Growing Up Comm. So it just so happens that the episodes that I've been hosting are now live. They're dropped. A shameless plug for checking them out. Another shameless plug for our Student and Early Career reception on Sunday night that we'll be hosting, and hopefully can talk more about podcasting. So our series really explores things that are useful and important for students and early career scholars. Of course, we hope that they'll be useful for everyone, but they really are dedicated to thinking about the needs and perspective of student and early career scholars. So we've got things about the job market in North America and outside of North America. We've got things about how to sort of succeed in industry and academia, and general knowledge, I think, that would be useful for everyone. And some of my co-hosts are in the audience here, so I'm sure they'll happily tell you more about their episodes as well.
Please, I hope so. Wonderful. I should say that next up we have Nicole Ellison introducing JCMC, the discussion section, and Nicole is at University of Michigan.
Yes, hi. Nice to see everyone, and thank you again, Nosh, for helping to push us all along. So JCMC, the discussion section, is meant to be kind of an expansive think piece companion to the Journal of Computer Mediated Communication. As when I was thinking about the name of the podcast, the discussion section seemed very natural. It's my favorite part of a paper, and it's where we can kind of go beyond, talking about the literature and what's been done and what we did for a particular study, and really make connections to other ideas, and to be a little bit more kind of speculative and intellectually expansive. And that's really my kind of vision for the podcast. So we have 2 recorded, there's one intro one and then 2 recorded that aren't up yet. One is a discussion with 3 of my associate editors, Katie Pierce, Caleb Carr, and Lee Humphreys, where we're talking about the nature of CMC theory today and in the future. And then the second is with a JCMC author, Linda Duxbury, where we talk about her paper, but also kind of go beyond that. And the paper is about email overload and how we think about whether emails are urgent and or important. And so I think moving forward, I want to continue to work with JCMC authors to give them another platform for sharing ideas about their work, and also to kind of be able to unpack a little bit of the backstory that doesn't make it into the paper that I think can be really informative, especially for junior folks. And also just to, we all know that the academic publishing timeline sometimes feels a bit longer than we would like. So I also want to kind of capitalize on the faster turnaround and offer folks a place to kind of think about things that are happening in the world outside of the kind of boundaries of the academic article. So thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I hope that, maybe some of our other journals, this will lead the way for some of our other journal-specific audio content that can happen. So this is really exciting. And finally, in person, we have here Patrice Buzzanell. Patrice is at the University of South Florida and will introduce Communicating for Impact.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And thank you, Nasir, for inviting me to participate in the podcasts. So Communicating for Impact really answers questions I had as an undergraduate and a graduate student and continuing through my career. What is it that we tell people in academia and outside of academia that our work is useful for? And of course, we always have the practical implications sections of our papers. We ourselves can find bridges to these pragmatic applications. But this part of the series, this podcast series, actually focuses in on what do we do with communication theory, with communication research, in ways that can affect our everyday lives, in ways that we can use creatively, and perhaps the ways some of our findings are used ironically, such that the researchers didn't anticipate what is happening with the research. So the focus, again, communicating for impact. Impact is multi-level. It can be on the individual level, the familial level, organizational, societal level. So one of the first podcasts that we have recorded, for example, has to do with AI, machine learning, different kinds of technologies and what's happening with regard to everyday life, and particularly with regard to gendered violence and political activism that may or may not be functional for particular groups. We also have some that are upcoming that will be on arts-based and technological therapies for example, dementia, as well as some things that affect children. We have some that are coming up that have to do with sleep and mindless and media use, for example, and some other ones as well. But I'm just very, very excited about trying to get the research out in a way that people who are not academicians can actually see the utility in their lives, understanding, of course, that not everything would be transferable based on where people are located.
Thank you. And so I think you get a sense of the range. Let me also say that Ellen Wartella was initially planned to be here to introduce Architects of Communication Scholarship, but I believe came down with COVID and was unable to be present. However, I listened to a few episodes of this incredible podcast, and what I heard was a discussion from Eddie Kuo, Professor Eddie Kuo, discussing his sort of how he, just his journey as a communication scholar, and through that speaking to a number of issues in our field and how they manifest in places like Singapore and in Asia. And it was just, again, I struggled to think where else would I have gotten that kind of content, that kind of narrative, where there's interventions happening in real time, but also really just, kind of putting that human narrative on a really profound and important communication scholar. So really, really important stuff. So yeah, why don't we get a round of applause for the new podcast we got? I do also want to acknowledge, on the schedule we have, I believe it's pronounced Ika Rinke, Laura Schurz, I'm probably butchering these names, Christine Cook. I just want to acknowledge their contribution because they're in the program and have contributed to this, but probably were unable to be here. I want to make sure I mention that. All right. So from here, what I'd like to do is really just have some questions and conversation to kick things off a little bit. And maybe to sort of welcome Mohan back in, I just want to start out with this question. What are some of the ways that we can use this kind of medium to address some of the hierarchies, both in our field, regional hierarchies, hierarchies around gender, race, and identity categories? What are some of the ways that we can best use this medium to address those things, and also even in our professional organizations, right? Because that's a thing that I know is an ongoing and important conversation. So, and journals. Mohan, would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely, Jen. I think, when Nosh first approached me with this opening, I thought that it's really beautiful because it actually creates the space and the infrastructure, if you will, for diverse kinds of voices from the Global South that do not perhaps often lend themselves to the world of the text. Now, what do I mean by that? For many struggles of the Global South, knowledge is expressed through oral traditions. Knowledge is carried intergenerationally. So, for instance, for Maori, in terms of the decolonizing struggles, the knowledge of those struggles are carried through conversations across generations connecting to whakapapa, the struggle for the land. Now, that kind of oral tradition lends itself well to the medium of the podcast, if you will, but it also actually sort of bypasses at multiple levels the infrastructures of gatekeeping in terms of how you consider knowledge, how is knowledge produced, and how is knowledge considered legitimate. Now, a part of this process then in terms of, and one of the things I have recognized through this journey is really thinking through where are the missing voices, how are these voices being continually erased, and more importantly, how do we often, with connections to the global north or with recognition because we are connected to the global north, actually end up occupying the spaces in the name of the global south, which ends up co-opting the possibilities for transformation. So that also actually raises a really important question in terms of form and the processes of building this invitational space, which is that, what really is radically transformative about these processes of building the infrastructure, and would incrementalism really work, where we continue to work and play through the same circuits of power and control that reproduce hegemonic power. So what I have found really powerful in this sense is really turning to the ideas of networks that are grounded in the sort of something that's not really new, but has historically shaped many of the ideas of Global South, and that is the notion of South-South solidarity. So if you look at the non-aligned movement or the Tricontinental Journal, these were some of the foundational spaces from the 1950s up until the 1970s to forge solidarities across southern spaces within Asia, between Asia and Africa. Between Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and then connected with African-American struggles and indigenous struggles. So I think, there is a lot to be unpacked there and learned from in terms of how you do the work of building this infrastructure so that this space really becomes one for inviting in radically divergent voices that offer us openings for imagining other worlds.
Very well said, very well said. And as we have this conversation, please, if you would like to contribute from the audience or scholars on the panel, contribute. I'm actually going to invite Sarah. Your podcast also, when I listened to it, I saw a very deliberate effort to center particular kinds of scholars and particular kinds of questions and interventions. Would you like to talk about this issue of how you approach addressing these hierarchies through this medium?
This Sarah, right? Yeah.
Oh,
okay.
yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Sarah
okay,
Banet-Weiser.
okay.
Yes, I'm sorry. We have two
yes,
Sarahs.
I'd love to. It's a really good question, and I think that I think I've been thinking about the podcast and feminism and the conjuncture in two different ways that came up, at least two different ways that came up in my conversations with my guests. thought of this in this conversation with Nosh because I had a pre-conference called Feminist Networks, New Patriarchies, and the Conjuncture yesterday. And what we were thinking about, the organizers of this pre-conference, is how do we make sense of the daily onslaught of sexual and gendered violence that we hear about in a moment when there is also a very heightened visibility of sort of popular feminism. How do we make sense of this disconnect? How do we make sense? What are the connections between, white nationalism and misogyny and anti-feminism and gender ideology and taking away reproductive rights for women, and the sort of systematic way in which these gendered violences and gendered harms are happening? How do we talk about them in a way that kind of captures those moments? And like Nicole said, scholarly publishing takes a really long time, right? And it's very difficult, to think about, like, how do we talk about, believe women in the moment of post-truth and then have it published like 3 years later, and when there's a whole new crisis happening. So I really felt like our conversations about things like, that were happening in this conjuncture were really, really helpful to have kind of on the ground. And to be thinking about these and to invite people to talk about what they were thinking about at that moment. Because again, unfortunately, this is a joke among feminists. The world continues to give us material, so we will always be in business. So that's one of the ways in which it addresses these hierarchies that you were talking about, Chenjerai. The other way is, and this really came up in the episode that I had with Sarah Jackson on a feminist ethic of care. And that is that I think it's time to reimagine what scholarship looks like. It's time to think about different models. It doesn't mean that we have to jettison the old ones, but it does mean that there's different ways in which, we can think about what scholarship, how do we hear it? How do we listen to it? How do we, talk about it? And so I think that's another, one of those things. The episode, Sarah and I talked about, what if on our, if we are in the privileged position to have a tenure track position at an university, what if we built into those tenure and promotion statements how we cared? How we cared. How do we think about an ethic of care, as not just kind of work that we all do all the time anyway, but that we can actually have it be explicitly acknowledged and recognized. And so that was part of, again, this way of thinking about a different sort of scholarship, a different way of listening to each other, a different way of engaging with each other. And as I was joking about before, I had never been a podcast host, but I was really, I loved that moment of it, that we had these conversations about things that happened in the news that day, but that also structure our lives as academics and as scholars. So that's kind of how I did it.
Wow. Yes. I don't know if do we have microphones set up there?
Yep, right there.
If you want to, this way the online people could hear you as well. Yeah, I'm sorry, yes. Sorry, I probably could have, I'm not even going to mess with the tech.
So I don't know if this is like a question or a statement, but just going off of what you were saying, Sarah, about like, it's time to reimagine scholarship. It just has me thinking because like the question that was asked, like how is this like fighting hegemony basically, it's like podcasting can reinforce hegemony or resist it, right? It's about how we're doing it. And personally, I think that podcasting is gonna experience a lot of resistance, especially because you're combating epistemic oppression. And especially in communication, we don't fall on that. Like there's very standard methods on how things are supposed to be done. And so like, to me, I'm just thinking about how do we keep working towards fighting epistemic oppression while being able to be in the space, right? So like, for me, soon I'll be working on my dissertation, and my goal, hopefully, is that it doesn't happen in a standard traditional dissertation, and then I can incorporate podcasting because I'm working with people from where I'm from, Flint, Michigan, and highlighting our stories and using that as knowledge, and it not being in a way that's oppressive, because lots of research has been done on Flint folks that have been harmful, you know? So I'm just thinking about the ways in which not only are we resisting it, but the ways in which that's falling on our personhood when this is our, you know, our livelihood in a lot of ways. And so the barriers that we're facing, and y'all, for the most part, seem more established than, you know, graduate student, but like, what are y'all doing in the process to kind of like gain that support? Because I can say that I haven't had a lot of support to make it knowledgeable. Like, the only way that it's considered knowledge is if we want to run an IRB on it and then write a paper on it and do all the other stuff that makes it traditional research.
Wow, thank you so much. Could I know your name, could we know your name?
I'm Ashley Lambert.
Okay, and well, thank you so much for that really powerful comment. Does any of our panelists want to respond? Moya?
Yeah, I do. I really appreciate that. I mean, part of me doing the Digital Alchemy podcast was really to talk about process. And I think so much of our ethics come into how not just the products that we produce, like a dissertation, even a podcast episode, but how we treat people in the process of creating the work that we're doing. So you're in Flint, I think a lot about the work of the Allied Media Project in Detroit, which has been really central to my practice in thinking about process. How do we show up for the communities that we come from and don't have an extractive relationship that so much of the academy has really moved us to valorize in some way. And I see the podcast episode and the things that are done through the way we treat each other in the process of creating it, giving us another opportunity to think about ethics beyond what, again, is produced. So for me, that also includes, how do I talk to people about an invitation to come to the podcast? Are there opportunities for them to necessarily get more exposure? I'm really trying to focus on interviewing people who aren't in the academy, finding ways to get them at least a little bit of money for their participation. So just thinking about other ways that we can support people who don't have access to the material that the academy provides. Are there ways that we can leverage our resources and this particular academic cachet, also perhaps in the way that Mohan was talking about, what does it mean to be connected to the global north, and how can we utilize that in a way that creates more possibilities for people outside of that?
Yes, absolutely. I think, and that's the kind of transition to a question that I was planning on asking as well, which is, and I'd like to invite, all our panelists and everyone, how can we best use this medium to think about ways to support junior scholars, our graduate students, who are trying to navigate both this organization and their careers, which can be, I know as someone who came to my first ICA in 2009, can be quite intimidating and confusing, trying to navigate different divisions, and also just to be sort of seen and heard, like those kinds of things, I think, and how can we best use it? I'm just interested to hear people's idea. I'm also thinking about, like growing up Comm, and I should say, Mary Beth Oliver, our president, was going to introduce the podcast Ask Us Anything as an ICA podcast that they just, I think, was a place where they're going to address maybe some more basic questions about ICA and things like that. But yeah, any ideas about how we can use this in that really important aspect of our work? Patrice.
This isn't a profound answer. I've been listening to some of the answers going, oh, that's so eloquent and beautiful, what I'm listening to. But I would encourage people in the audience, people who are listening virtually, to come to us with ideas. I would think that everybody here who's been doing the podcast is doing the same kind of process that my assistant and I are doing, and that is we are scouring ICA research. We have tons of spreadsheets going, trying to make sure that we have as much diversity, from regional diversity, disciplinary diversity, methodological diversity, topics, and so on, that we can start to capture the broad array, the magnificent array of what we're doing in communication, but that doesn't mean we know everybody. And so contacting us via email, calling us, if you get our cell phone numbers, texting us, would certainly be ways in which we can come up with some different ideas that would be beneficial to audience members, both in academe and outside of academe, and bring in people we may not have necessarily thought about. Because I think this is just a wonderful opportunity for our members and outside of our field, certainly, to be able to promote the kinds of research and applications that we have. I think that this also refers to the earlier question, again, not as eloquent as what we were hearing about knowledges in the Global South and reimagining and so on, but also just the idea that we are trying to make this as inclusive as possible. And that was an early conversation that Nasheer and I had. It's like, what can we actually do to make sure that we are broad enough and deep enough so that we are displaying our field, but also the central issues and controversies that we're facing right now.
I'll jump in, and I guess just from a technology perspective, I can't help but think about the affordances of the podcast. And so part of that is around accessibility and just the fact that, yes, you need a phone, yes, you need an internet connection. But other than that, I think it's, you could make an argument about the podcast being kind of more globally accessible in terms of different kinds of abilities and whatnot. But then I was also just thinking about this question of kind of demystifying what it means to be just about kind of status differences in academe, right? And just the fact that with a podcast, you can kind of sneak them in while you're doing other things, and it's kind of intimate to hear a human voice in your ear, and just how, I could think about how the format itself just kind of offers a window into researchers as human beings. Right? Talking about their work, not in this kind of, as you nicely said, this kind of, the rigid confines of the scholarly written article, but rather being able to be a little bit more human.
Yes, absolutely. Sarah, did you want to also?
Yeah, I think that's sort of already been said. I totally agree with, and to offer the idea, at least for students and early career scholars, the Growing Up Comm and all these other podcasts, the goal, I think, is a little bit to demystify and to show what we might think of as the hidden curriculum, the things that are unspoken or unsaid or word of mouth, but to actually be able to give it to so many ears and whoever is listening gets that same information. You don't have to have, it's not just an advisor or a colleague or something who's sort of walking you through how it goes, but a peer who's doing it to anyone who wants to listen. And so I think that part of Growing Up Comm, the way I imagine it and my co-host is showing off that hidden curriculum, the things we don't talk about.
And Sarah didn't say this, but I put a shameless plug for the most recent episode of Growing Up Comm, which is actually about how student and early career people can navigate their first conference. Chenjerai, you talked about yours, was it 2000, what you said, your first
2009,
conference?
yeah.
2009. And mine was 1985.
Wow.
But it was as difficult then as it is now, but now that we have these podcasts, that might help us actually get a better way of being able to navigate the audience. So I got three little points that are connected to what this is. One is, when I began to think through how ICA could contribute to and why ICA should contribute to podcasts, one of the things that I spent a lot of time thinking about were the various audiences. On the one hand, the audiences are broadening within our discipline, increasing the awareness of areas like interventions in the Global South, which is one of the reasons why I reached out to folks like Mohan on that, but also to focus on new cutting-edge issues that might be underrepresented in our fields, and so, or at least in the quote-unquote mainstream of ICA, and that's why folks like Moya and Sarah came in terms of being able to amplify voices that I thought are important, influential, and need to be amplified in that case. But the other part of it is also to reach outside our field. And so a lot of what Patrice's work is, yes, it'll be read by people in our field, but it also takes it and makes that translation to people outside to recognize that what we do is important in that area. And then the other audience that I thought was very important, in addition to the student and early career part of it, which I'm so thrilled that CCAC was willing to jump in there, and the names of the people that Chenjerai was reading, the other names, Chrissy Cook, et cetera, they're all part of the CCAC collection there, is the audience of students, not necessarily in the top tier schools, who may have had conversations when some of the illustrious scholars come and visit their campuses, but everyone can benefit from it. And that's why things like the Architects of Communication Scholarship, to me, is really a powerful way to get to know a scholar and to demystify them, as someone mentioned, to learn more about what it is that made them tick, how did they get started? And some of the stories are quite inspiring about some of our senior scholars. One that I recently, that is about to be published, if it's not, is with Daphna Lemish, talking about how when she was trying to go through the early stages, as a woman, she was facing with a lot of different challenges, et cetera. And what that inspires, I think, would inspire people for us to, for young students today to learn about it. So I can see that as an added, you put a reading list, you put this major theory out there, an article, and then you say, oh, and you can also listen to a podcast that tells you a little behind the scenes about it. And exactly the same thing with Nicole's work, because you have JCMC, you have these articles, and then let me tell you what didn't make it to the article, but it's the behind the scenes stories and so on. So for example, two very quick points. Patrice mentioned, emailing us with ideas of things, etc. I have to do this obligatorily, but ICA has also something called The Link, which is their own internal social media platform. And I was asked by the executive committee, if ICA is going to do this and do it for free for everyone else, then what's the benefit for the ICA members? So the ICA members, the only benefit they have is they can go to The Link, which is an ICA-only platform. And we already have channels there for every single one of these podcasts. And the idea is to have a discussion with potential hosts and guests on that after the episode has happened, or to crowdsource ideas of topics that are there. So in addition to reaching out on email and text messaging the hosts, that also is a channel that is specifically created to make this more egalitarian, to bring in people from different areas. The last point in terms of accessibility, right now we have transcripts on all the websites. Right now they're only in English, I'm sorry to say, but we have plans to be able to also put them in multiple languages so that at least the transcripts, if not the audio, will be available to a broader audience. I'll stop there.
Yes, and real briefly, I want to say, all this potential, though, does rely on everyone engaging with the platform. We don't want this to be content that sits there. So please, I encourage everyone, it seems to me quite easy on the ICA site, if you find where the podcast network is, to click on the thing and you'll be linked to the various platforms. But having said that, let's, Sarah, did you want to join?
Yeah, I just have a couple of points to kind of connect all this and to your question. One is just another layer of demystification that you both spoke about. I also, before I did this, didn't realize that actually podcasting is easy, right? It doesn't, actually Moya helped me with that, because I was like, oh my God, I can't do this. If you have a successful podcast, you're like, you just record it, And so it actually is something that can be demystified as a certain sort of production that may seem intimidating. So I think that is an important point to make. The other thing is again, back to my earlier point about reimagining. So this ICA Presents is a production that you and Mary Beth thought about. It's now, there are ICA podcasts. I hope that it continues to have ICA podcasts, because we all know that one of the things that ends up legitimating particular kinds of scholarship is ICA, right? And so if ICA says that this is scholarship and this is what we're doing and it's important, then maybe people will assign an episode in our classes, put them on the syllabus, put them, If you haven't listened to Chenjerai's incredible podcast on civil, you should, because it is a wealth of scholarship and history and urgent issues that I have learned so much from in its scholarship, and so I think that we need to, the hidden curriculum, Sarah, that you were talking about, we need to make some of this, we need to, make it unhidden, right? We need to not even talk about it as hidden curriculum anymore. This is the curriculum.
Wow, I really appreciate that whole intervention. And I just want to underscore, when I was listening to the podcast on this network, instantly I started writing down moments I want to assign in class, for students to listen to, for all, oftentimes you're looking for content that can be accessible to various kinds of students, but that it maybe is not like a 60-page reading always, although nothing wrong with a 60-page reading, I love that, if it's a good one. But my point is that, or to complement the reading, right? To take what you get in the reading, the really slow, version of it, and then let's hear from this scholar and hear how they talked about producing their research. So yeah, the pedagogical piece of it is really important. We have an audience comment.
Hi everyone, my name is Kim Fox. I teach at the American University in Cairo. I teach podcasts, I research podcasts.
Welcome.
So thank you for this opportunity to share podcasting knowledge. And I just want to build quickly, this is not my question yet, about the pedagogical approach. Identifying podcast episodes and then creating a bit of a guide to go with that is one way to push out that episode and make it easy for people to adopt for their classes. Sometimes the work needs to be done on the back end so that we can just pick it up and run.
That's wonderful. Like maybe this might be something ICA could take on if we could find the resources. That's an incredible idea.
Yeah, this makes it easy because, we want to have that really quick jump in and get it done. If someone builds that out and it's already there, it's really great. My question for you is, and maybe I missed this, where is the podcast being produced? How do you get to be a part of the team? How do you get to be a part of someone being interviewed, be on the podcast? So I'm very interested in the logistics of the podcast that you all are producing. Thank you.
I'll be happy to take that on. So there's a side of me that has always been fascinated by being a tech entrepreneur within academia. And so one of the privileges of being ICA president-elect is that I joke about this, but only half jokingly, that the ICA conference would happen if the ICA president-elect went to sleep and didn't wake up till after the conference, because we have such a fantastic ICA staff at headquarters that they're going to make this train run on time and do everything. I mean, we always have a few quirks, but they make that happen. One of the luxuries I had was to do what you were talking about, and that is to think about something that might be new, novel, and to experiment with it. And so at this point, the logistics is essentially Northwestern University. So Northwestern University students have done all of the production, undergraduate students. I'm fortunate to be at a university where we have some pretty good production folks, so they're the ones who are doing all of this production work. I personally reached out, and this is, of course, limited by my network, but I reached out to the hosts that we are talking about here, and also there are more on the way. So there are at least 2 or 3 that are pretty close to getting ready, so stay tuned for those. That, again, I've offered to do this. So one part of it that you might ask is, well, who's paying for all of this stuff? And so the payment right now, I drew on my network. So part of it was I went to institutions that I believed had the funds, and I used a fairly simple argument that I think was compelling in some cases. I said, the way that is being budgeted right now by Northwestern, students doing it, it's about $1,200 an episode. So if you have a monthly episode for a year, that's $14,400 as a sponsorship. That's pittance compared to one ICA reception that many of these universities do at a conference like this, and some of which will be happening tonight, for example. And so that tugged on people, and so as a result, I was able to get close to about $100,000 worth of sponsorship for almost all, but not all of the podcasts. And so they came from universities as diverse as Hong Kong Baptist, Nanyang Technological, University of Pennsylvania, U.S. Barenberg Center for Collaborative Communication, Northwestern University in Qatar, which is funding the interventions for the Global South, University of South Florida. And there are still others in the pipeline. Again, I wish I could say it right now, but we still have at least 2 or 3 more who are actually coming to us and saying, we will want to sponsor these things. One of them said, it's a no-brainer. Let's just work out the details of how much. Some of them are sponsoring 24 episodes of Architectural Communication Scholarship. For example, Hong Kong Baptist said, we'll do 24 episodes of that one. So we are doing okay on this front. One of the questions that my next person in line, Unju Lee, the next president-elect, and I have talked about is my responsibility to ICA to keep this sustainable beyond my term as president-elect and then president. And that is something that weighs very heavily on me. How do we make this to the point where it's sustainable? It's nice to be an entrepreneur, but we need to make that adolescent transition to make this continue beyond that. And so I'm looking for ideas on that. I'm looking for places that might be underwriters for something like this, maybe foundations, if anyone has any ideas. But we are still very much on the entrepreneurial stage. And I give a lot of props to the Northwestern students for really doing everything that you see on that platform. One last point that I was going to mention, Sarah mentioned Chenjerai's Uncivil. We have a lot of podcasts that are not ones that we created, but which are already being done by ICA membership from around the world. And so on that ICA Podcast Network page on ICA, if you Google ICA Podcast Network, at the bottom it says ICA Podcast Network recommends, and that takes you to a page that gives you a tiled list of all the other fantastic podcasts, including Uncivil, of course, but several others that are being done by our scholars, and so it makes it easy in that way to be able to click to all of those.
Yes, thank you for this wonderful question. We would be remiss not to address several critical issues, and we're kind of in that sort of production critical space a little bit. So there's a number of critical issues that would include things like the fact that not everyone making podcasts has, there's some, when we look at some of the worrisome developments in the world, and I want to leave space for a range of political tendency here. But when I see the kind of things I'm talking about in terms of patriarchy, in terms of racism, in terms of capitalist exploitation, there are podcasts out there actively promoting that in podcast communities. So it's really important for us not to imagine, as we celebrate ICA's network, that this larger medium doesn't have those issues. So that's one thing to throw out there. But also these issues of production. I just want to say, okay, when I made Uncivil, I made a podcast called Uncivil in 2000. It was released in 2017 with a large sort of corporate company called Gimlet Media, which now was purchased by Spotify. And what I saw at that time was an explosion of this kind of content. It's a narrative style podcast that takes a lot of production. And there were a couple of things that I noticed. One was that the way that podcasts were being produced inside of these kind of corporate spaces. They were producing a lot of content that was engaged with by scholars, both in the classroom. It also was a place where, we're often bringing in scholars, historians and different people with their voices are getting out. I had one scholar tell me she had more engagement on her book based on the podcast than she had from any kind of journal activity, which is, and so those are all interesting things, but the fact that these things are being produced by corporations made me say, should corporations be the only place, or even increasingly corporate public radio, that are dictating the values? Because sometimes podcasts are oral history, right? There's so many things that are happening. There are modes of organizing where you're going to get the voices of people in Flint into the conversation. Their actual voices, not speaking for them. And what I found is in these corporate contexts, you don't have time to prioritize those kind of values. They're looking at podcasts as ad real estate, right? And then they move on to the next thing, even though some of them have sponsored tours. So, and then there's the production, right? It's a lot of work. It is work. I mean, it's easier than one might think with some of these platforms, but even platforms like Anchor, now owned by Spotify, what they kind of do is they give you a really easy platform, but then they control all the intellectual property in ways that are not always obvious up front. So I think there's a lot of ways that critical issues, and I guess we should also be a force. I mean, it sounds like we're already thinking about those things, but also thinking in terms of care, because I'm just going to say, this is Chenjerai speaking for myself, but these neoliberal capitalist forces would love for us to do more work, just add more stuff on, oh, great, you want to do podcasts? Great, here's more work for you to do in ways that will reproduce these problems. So does anyone want to comment on how we can push back against that a bit?
Well, I would say, I would just say, we need to, if we're just talking specifically about podcasts, we need to value them. We need to, value them as work. And I will also say that I kind of misspoke. I said it was easy to do a podcast. I just meant it was easy for the host.
Oh, yes.
The production is hard, and I didn't mean to eclipse the whole behind-the-scenes stuff. But I think that if we revalue what we understand as things that, that are important for an academic career. And if we if we newly value podcast as scholarship, then you can't just say, oh, well, your podcast is great and people are listening and people are learning, but you also have to do all this other stuff, right? Because that's the stuff that counts. If we actually, revalue or value podcasts as work and as scholarship, then I think that could change a little bit.
Wonderful, absolutely, yeah.
I'm
Moya?
also
Yeah.
thinking about podcasts in the context of mediums that predate it. So thinking about radio as another site where we've had the opportunity for a public conversation. And just as you were saying, we're switching from what used to be a more open channel of public radio to something that's more corporatized. So trying to figure out how we can make these podcasts actually reach an audience even beyond ICA, because there's so much here that I think is giving us the opportunity to expand who is included in conversation, both in terms of who is talking and also how we can make opportunities for new mediums that we are building on from mediums that we've used previously.
Yes, Mohan. Yeah. Are you muted? Yeah. Great.
I just want to echo what Sarah and Moya are stating, particularly in terms of labor of the Global South. So one of the things we have seen historically happen is that diverse forms of labor of the Global South have been exploited and extracted and turned into legitimate knowledge systems that have only profited those in the Global North. So this really relates to then how we measure scholarship, what are the kinds of metrics that we use, and the kinds of ways in which we map out promotion and tenure processes, for instance. So I hope, there is an ICA pre-conference we had on multimodality and multimodal forms of scholarship. And I think that these are good signs in terms of really leading that conversation about what counts as knowledge and really dismantling, if you will, the traditional structures of what make up knowledge to create new openings that actually recognize these diverse forms of labor as knowledge. Because, one of the things, for instance, here in Aotearoa, we have seen is that the work of engagement, the work of community-based struggles that are often carried out by indigenous academics, they don't get counted. So that work of labor and care gets done. But then what you find is that people that are doing that work and therefore are overburdened because of doing that work actually then do not move through the system. So that has to fundamentally change and transform.
Absolutely. We have an audience question or comment.
Hi, it sounds repetitive probably in my mind, but with no disrespect, I feel like y'all are still kind of missing the question, because I'm interested in seeing how are y'all overcoming the barriers, because a lot of y'all are already established with the podcast, and it seems from the talk that we're having that it's kind of accepted within your departments or whatnot. So I'm wondering what resistance did you all face, and how are you overcoming that to say, not just to say is it valuable, but how are you pushing that when you're meeting that resistance? Because as a student, I haven't had an opportunity for it to say this is knowledgeable, but you have to do everything else to make it knowledgeable. It's not seen as knowledge in a lot of ways.
I'll say that I really started my activism as an undergrad and then also as a grad student. So my trajectory really started before I was quote unquote established, in the way that people, I think, responded to it required both the desire to do the work that is extra, unfortunately, and then also having people understand that the work had merit beyond the context or confines of the disciplinary boundaries that I was associated with. So I'm new to ICA. I'm new to communication. This is my first ICA conference, and I think it has a lot to do with being willing to take the risks as a young person who valued the communities that I came from even before there was academic recognition that that was acceptable. So I think it's both the willingness to take the risk and then also finding support from people beyond perhaps even your immediate department or communication studies focus, who are able to see the value in the work, not just within your own network. So even building communication community across multiple institutions, I think, is one way to overcome that feeling of being isolated and alone.
Let me add
yeah, please,
to that.
please, yeah.
I think in listening to some of the podcasts, and also especially the architects' podcasts, and looking at the people who are here, many of us were told early in our career, you can't do that. Or we were told by even our committee members, nobody is studying that. Why on earth are you studying this thing? Or you're doing a presidential address and somebody will come up and say, nobody studies resilience, is what happened with mine. And they're not doing, and that you're not doing it the right way also. And this has happened with some of the feminist and indigenous and other kinds of scholarship. I would say look at the people who are here and then look at some of the podcasts, because these are the people who are at the forefront, both in the past and at the present, of making these kinds of changes, who would be willing to be allies. I mean, we're not getting paid for doing these podcasts. We're doing it because we love ICA. You know, we've been dedicated and committed to ICA, but also we see a benefit for getting our research, our practice, our values, broadly speaking, right, out there. And so I would say, connect with us to help you to do the kinds of things you want to do. Many of us are in departments where the traditional format for a dissertation is not the thing that you need to do. Or there's other kinds of research that we can tell you, okay, this is how I, or this is how somebody else made this inroad to do this kind of research and get it in a form that is recognized in terms of careers. So I'll just mention that.
Yeah, I mean, I just would, definitely second everything that's been said. I would, one, I want to say, it sounds like we might have a future ICA Podcast Network host among us, for one. Two, I just want to say that, again, I use the term established, and I'm really glad that it feels that way. I think that's a compliment to the work. This is a launch of something that has not really previously existed at this level. And so I think you're absolutely right in raising this question and challenging us and inviting us to say, okay, now we've taken this level of institutionalization. How do we then make it further and make it feel accessible to people who are really out there in the field? And finally, I want to say that, as someone who's been doing this for a while and very much at the center of these, like in the midst of these struggles between what constitutes scholarship, one thing I'll say is, there are people who will try to take my work on podcasting, which has reached a wide audience, and sort of use it to say, well, you're not like other scholars because you're reaching other people. And I always push back against that very strongly. And I say, the foundation of my success in podcasting has been the ways that I learned to think, how I learned to process issues, right? I mean, like literally when I'm being pulled in by places like NPR or other issues, it's because of a certain kind of scholarly expertise that I built in this discipline through slow forms of engagement, that, through reading and through people who are engaging with people who did archival work. I don't want someone who's doing powerful archival work to have to also make a podcast, right? Because I really value that. And I just want to say, because we're coming to a close here, but just really briefly to return to a point that was made by several panelists. When we talk about the issues, and by the way, if you need some help, these are the people dissertation-wise to make that case, we here, you know what I mean? Holla at us, for real. But when it comes to speaking to issues in the real time, we're facing real serious threats to reproductive rights. What I found before is that, like I remember a moment in production where a young producer on the show said, I said, you should probably holler at a couple of scholars to interview for this episode. And the person said, I don't like talking to those PhDs. I like talking to people like bang, bang, bang. They named about 5 people. All of them were professors, right? But the way that this person saw them and heard their voices was through social media, a lot of times through Twitter. And I don't, without kind of painting Twitter in a purely negative light, what I would say is Twitter isn't really about listening. I'm just going to go ahead and say that out there. Maybe Moya and other people who have more expertise can challenge me, but it's not really about listening. When I listen to Digital Alchemy, when I listen to Feminist Conjuncture or Growing Up Comm, I'm having to listen. That's especially important for men, right? I can't interrupt. I can try to interrupt, and I think that it invites a slower kind of engagement that is fast in the sense that you can make a podcast and put it out to speak to attacks on reproductive health, but slow in the sense that you listen. You can rewind. Like you're going to see panels now where someone's going to be making an incredible point and you'll be scrambling to take notes while the next point is being made. The great thing about reading and podcast listening is that you can go back and rewind actually that exact point and hear how it was made. So I just wanted to throw those in there. We have we're kind of at the end, so maybe just out of respect for time, we'll end it here, but hopefully the conversation continues to go on. I mean, maybe if there's somebody who has something really pressing, I don't want
30 seconds.
Steal the last word. Yes.
When I started this, a lot of senior scholars in the field, this also speaks to you, said to me, who listens? I mean, why are we doing podcasts? It's a waste of time. We shouldn't be doing this. This is, and then the younger people, in particular one person, Ravi Ratan, who's a faculty member at Michigan State, he convinced this senior scholar that no, in the old days, online journals was a hip thing. Today, podcast is a hip thing. And so I was excited about it. And then 3 weeks ago, I was talking to Ravi Ratan, and he said, I don't know about podcasts. I think we need to move to TikTok. So I don't know. I may be getting old here.
Well, anyway, let's have a warm round of applause for our panelists. And I just want to thank everyone for really leading in this way, for all the behind-the-scenes work, the team at Northwestern and all the undergraduate students, all that work. Mohan, for joining us, thank you. And please, everybody engage, subscribe, let's exchange, and let's get it popping, as they say, all right? Have a good ICA.